And next we have Collecting the Goddess, a LitRPG adventure, Chronicles of KieraFreya, book number 1, written by Michael Anderle. This is 616 pages, $4.99, available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. What is a billionaire heiress supposed to do with all of her older siblings take to business like her parents, proving that business is in their blood, but not hers? There are many good choices. Unfortunately, Chloe decided that partying was the right one. Now, a requirement to keep her money requires her to attend daily meetings with the family psychologist. A daily meeting about how she should change her life to change her future. The worst part, the meetings are before noon, so she has to get up early. Then he presents her with an offer. Invest in a new game company and become the first player to stay inside their full-immersion pod for 2 years. 2 years away from her parents looking down on her and not having to listen to her siblings with their success. Done. There is only one problem, rather. Chloe's avatar connects to a goddess of retribution who doesn't remember her past. Following the rabbit trail of armor to help the goddess will require more responsibility from Chloe than she has ever accepted in the past. Will she return to being the party girl of her past, or will the Lagarde daughter, tempered in fire from her upbringing, wake up? Go up and, there you go. That's it. Okay. This is a story from Michael Anderle, who's a write-to-market author, and this is his first true LitRPG one that he's advertised as such. And it doesn't really work on the RPG side for me. It works as the story itself is decently written, and I think a lot of people find it entertaining just as itself. It's okay, but it felt more like a virtual reality adventure story with some notifications and stat increases that didn't really matter. So on the game mechanic side, it honestly kind of fails for me because ultimately the game mechanic RPG progression stuff doesn't matter. That it's set in a virtual reality game, very clear, makes sense. The storyline itself is okay. After about the 10% mark, the setup is actually pretty decent. But after the 10% mark, the main character gets a ton of unearned power and is really kind of led by her nose on a bunch of adventures. So the character progression doesn't really exist in that respect. But the adventures themselves aren't terribly written. They just weren't particularly interesting for me because the RPG progression portion of it didn't really matter to the story. And sometimes there were conflicts that I'll get into. Okay. A lot of the story on its own felt like it was a little paint by numbers to make it LitRPG. There's nothing particularly bad about the story or this aspect of it, but it wasn't interesting either. There's some unrealistic behavior for the main character. There was also some plot holes that fed into this cyberpunk sub-story that I found a little annoying. Again, that's more personal. Like, I'm not big into cyberpunk being mixed into LitRPG. It's never really worked for me. And I've read quite a few stories where they've tried and it just doesn't work. Still, there's also like this slight in-game inconsistency within NPCs where some are aware that this is a game in some respects and some aren't. And I wish there was just more consistency in that respect. Also, the established game mechanics, which are established early in the game, in the story, but they were ignored whenever the story needs them to be, whenever the story needs to do something. And this is, again, one of those issues where the story is dictating whether or not the game mechanics are followed. So even if they're established, if they're not followed in the story, it feels like those RPG mechanics don't matter, which is always a thing for me in LitRPG. And again, that's a personal thing. If that doesn't matter to you, this will be less of an issue. As the story goes on, the RPG mechanics and progression lessens more and more, and you can kind of tell that the author got tired of continuing with the RPG mechanics and notifications because they're fairly regular and consistent in the beginning of the story, but by the mid and end of the story, oh, where'd all that RPG stuff go? And I'm like, okay, it is what it is. Story-wise, this is okay. It's not a terrible setup. Again, there are some larger plot holes. So I was like, oh, I can see why they're there to justify certain things in the story, but they don't really make sense. And some of the story twists don't make sense either to me sometimes, but still, on the whole, it's not a badly written story in any way, shape, or form. Otherwise, it's just kind of like this random adventuring and fighting. Main character fights bad guys, monsters, makes online friends, fights with her equipment on a regular basis. The banter was decent enough between her equipment, the goddess, and herself. But there was very little world building and character development. And I thought that was a little odd. It is what it is, though. Overall, this is technical RPG. It is. The RPG aspects of the story don't really seem to matter. And again, the story seems to ignore them whenever it needs to, even going against the established mechanics, which makes it feel just more like a virtual reality adventure story, which is some things that the author's written before. I don't know that the author is particularly a gamer. It doesn't feel like it, though. And that just may be what's showing here, in that those aspects aren't as important to him. The storyline, the story of being in a virtual world and having these responsibilities might just be more important to him. And that's what shows up a little more. Again, for me, it's not really a bad story. It's not good, though. And again, I couldn't get into the story just because, again, the RPG stuff didn't seem to matter that much. It felt like, especially towards the end of the story, it felt like, the effort wasn't there anymore from an otherwise good author. Like, I know Mike Anderle has a lot of fans, and his writing is generally good. And again, this isn't bad writing, but it's usually in other genres. And this is his first swing at this one, and I don't think it succeeds, for me at least. And I hope it improves in the future. But this one didn't work for me. That's what it comes down to. This one gets a score of 6 out of 10. That's Collecting the Goddess, a LitRPG adventure, Chronicles of KieraFreya, a book number 1.